Story continued from Utahraptor playlist. It has been 2 days since the Blades pack split into their 3 hunting parties in order to locate and bring down a meal big enough for the whole pack. As of a few hours ago, the group Strider was a part of was able to kill a subadult Moabosaurus. At 2 tons, this should be enough for the whole pack, and Strider's hunting party, led by the alpha male Claymore, have all had their fill. After killing the sauropod, the call was sent out to bring in the rest of the clan, and the second hunting party led by Dagger and his mate Sickle have only just arrived, eager to finally have a decent meal. The final party, led by the alpha female Nadashi, was still inbound, and would be bringing the pack's youngest members. This is why they had a majority of the large females with them in order to better protect the most vulnerable of the clan. Strider and his brother Roughguts were resting in the shade, keeping watch as the pack got back together. Strider had now told Roughguts about Blackback's death the previous day, and the siblings were still coming to terms with the loss. This was made more pressing, as the Blades had killed the Moabosaurus very close to the border between their territory and that of the Redclaw pack, or what used to be the Redclaw pack. Strider knew Redclaw herself was dead, having seen her body for himself. There was no telling what their old clan was called now. Strider had kept this from his brother, however. The burden was his to bear, and it's not like it mattered to them anymore. They were Blades now. The last thing they had to do to cast off the old ties they had was to choose new names for themselves. Something Roughguts wasn't in a rush to do, but Strider was. As if he wanted to take Falcon as his partner, he would have to change his name. But as the brothers looked over the territory that used to be their old home, they couldn't help but wonder how their old family were dealing with the current harsh, dry season. Then, from their position, the 2 siblings spotted movement in the ferns and between the trees. At first they weren't sure what it was, but soon it became clear that there were more than one, and they were large. Standing up in readiness, Strider and Roughguts watched, listened, and smelled the area in front of them, and soon the creatures in the foliage became more clear. They were Utahraptor, and they weren't the 3rd hunting party, but a rival clan. With confirmation of trespassers, the 2 siblings started to bark loudly, alerting the other members of the Blades to the interlopers. All the nearby pack members' heads shot up and turned to the barking duo, then each ran to their position, ready to back the brothers up and get a proper look at what they were dealing with. One by one, each of the Blades lined up to either side of Strider and Roughguts, peering into the tree line looking for the threat. Some started barking as well, others hissed and bared their teeth. It was a show of strength to intimidate the rival clan, and so far the intruders were staying hidden. A few moments pass, and then slowly, the invading pack began to slink out of cover and into the open. As they drew closer, Strider, to his disbelief, realized that he recognized some of the individuals now standing against him. This was the former Redclaw pack. They were cousins, aunts, and uncles, plus other new members that he didn't recognize. Former family members that had come back into his life, just as he had started to move on from them. The new pack were now in the open, and they formed their own line about 50 meters away from the Blades, hissing lowly and flexing their fingers ready to strike. The atmosphere was tense as the 2 groups sized each other up. Right now the intruders outnumbered the Blades, but that was only because a third of their group wasn't present. What was odd though, is that Strider's old pack had brought a large amount of subadults and even juveniles with them. This was abnormal, as usually only the adults go hunting, or, like now, move against a rival clan. Why did they bring their vulnerable with them? Taking a closer look, Strider could see that all of them were in one way or another not doing well. Almost all of them were gaunt, barely skin and bones. Clearly this pack had struggled with the harder dry season, and because of that, they now had to invade other territories just to survive. Others were covered in scars from both taking on prey and fighting amongst themselves, likely over scraps of food or from the social upheaval of their recent dead alphas. This clan was in a bad way, and were clearly desperate enough to challenge for a single sauropod carcass. The question was, who ran this starved cohort? Now at a standoff, Claymore stepped forward, breathed in, and let out a defiant roar, a clear show of strength, and to declare his carcass wouldn't be surrendered. Finally, from the line of invading Utahraptor, their leader stepped forward, and Strider couldn't believe his eyes. It was her. After what seemed like a lifetime ago, she was here in front of him. His sister, Swifttail, was alive. She had grown to her full size. In fact, she seemed as large as their mother was in life. Just like her, she had an intimidating and strong presence about her. What you'd expect from the leader of a pack. It all came together in Strider's head now. Redclaw had been killed by a rival, and shortly after Swifttail killed the usurper and claimed leadership over the pack. Though from the looks of it she hadn't chosen a suitable mate yet, probably because of the social strains on the group, and the harsh dry season was too much for the clan to concentrate on anything other than survival. Like the rest of them, Swifttail was thin, but seemed to be the healthiest, or at least the strongest of her clan. Strider and Roughguts both looked at each other, and the same expression of disbelief was cast across their faces. The last thing Strider had ever said to Swifttail was that maybe she'd be alpha of their family pack one day. Something that was meant to be a good future to look forward to, not this current struggle. Swifttail moved in front of her group, and responded to Claymore's roar with a roar of her own, one meant to show her own strength, and disguise how desperate her group was for mere scraps of food. Once again everything went silent, and the standoff returned, but without provocation, Strider slowly stepped forward, walking to Claymore, and then past him, not even acknowledging his leader, his focus squarely on Swifttail. The eyes of every Utahraptor on both sides darted to Strider breaking rank and advancing into the open space between the two clans, the last pair being Swifttail's own. The former siblings locked eyes, and while Strider's look of disbelief stayed, Swifttail's piercing gaze softened, though only slightly. They had both changed since they parted, but they both recognized each other so quickly. "Sister?" Strider spoke.
"Brother?"
Swifttail replied sternly, with what sounded like a hint of regret in her voice. The silence came back again. Strider was risking his position in the Blades pack just talking to an outsider, let alone his old pack. He was risking his place with Falcon and Roughguts' position as well. And for what? It had to be to stop a fight from breaking out. For the Blades, it was to not get anyone injured or killed. But for Swifttail, he just didn't want to see another family member die. "Turn around, Swifttail. Trust me, you don't want this fight," Strider told his sibling.
"There is no food left, Strider. We have no choice. You will leave this to us, or we will fight you full for it,"
Swifttail responded, with there being no room for interpretation. "You can't win this, sister. Your clan is starved, and it's clear you are desperate by bringing juveniles with you. For the sake of both our pack's survival, turn back. Trust me, like you used to." Strider asked his sister, who he once held in high regard.
"I'm sorry, Strider, but our old pack is gone. They are my responsibility now,"
Swifttail said quietly, as she raised herself up. Before Strider could stop her, Swifttail lifted her head to the sky and let out a harsh growl. The growl that ordered her clan to attack. The now swift-tailed pack screeched and growled in response before charging forward in response. Claymore drew low and roared back, and a moment later the blades roared in unison, and so began a charge of their own. Both clans swiftly closed the gap between each other, and a mass of limbs, feathers, claws, and teeth slammed together. Strider was right in the center of it all, and was pushed out of the way by a female blade who attacked Swifttail, but in the melee that erupted, he lost sight of her. He immediately had to worry about his own life, as a young male Utahraptor charged him. It bit at him again and again, but Strider dodged each strike. Eventually he had enough room and delivered a strong kick to his opponent's chest. He felt his foot break some of the male's ribs, and then he fell backwards, coughing and gasping for air. Strider looked around him and saw a mass of bodies throwing themselves at each other, as claws tore feathers and teeth drew blood. Another male tackled Strider from the side, forcing him to the ground. It then ran forward with open jaws, but Strider delivered 3 accurate kicks. The first swept one of the male's legs and he tumbled down. The second hit against the side of the male's face, forcing it to bend up. And the third hit the bottom jaw and made a snap as Strider broke his attacker's neck. It was a brief feeling of shock as Strider killed his first fellow Utahraptor. That shock was swept away as Strider rolled out of the way as a female almost crushed his skull under her foot. Strider completed the roll and leapt to his feet. He hissed at the large female and prepared to fight. She lunged but was suddenly pulled backwards slightly. Looking back, Rough Guts had grabbed her tail in his jaws and was violently hauling her back. She turned to assail Rough Guts, so Strider attacked, wrapping his jaws around her neck and pushing her upper body down. Rough Guts let go of her tail and bit her left leg before twisting outwards, forcing the female to the ground. Strider bit deeper into her neck when a random Utahraptor was thrown into him, forcing him off his target and hurtling him over a large log. Strider stood and shook his head, looking around to try and get a sense of what was going on. All around him, the blades and the Swifttails were tearing at each other with blind fury. Some had broken limbs, others broken jaws. Nearly all were injured. Strider saw Claymore trying to organize those around him, but the Swifttails were so vicious, no one could go a few seconds without being attacked. They fought with no consideration for their own safety, nor did they seem to work together except to gang up on a fallen foe. Because they were desperate. They knew that this was their one and only chance to survive, and they would kill anything in their way just to hold on for one more day. A young female about a third his size jumped on Strider's back and clawed into him, sinking the killing claws in her feet into his side. Strider screeched as he whipped his head around and bit down on her hips. He then tore her off himself and shook his head from side to side before slamming her body into the log. The nearly starving juvenile's body crumpled against the wood, and Strider dropped her to the ground. He caught a glimpse of Dagger being swarmed by about 6 juveniles, but his mate Sickle quickly came to his aid. Claymore battled a female in an intense duel. He was holding his own against a larger opponent, but Strider knew he had to help, but was bitten on the ankle by a raptor that's leg was broken. Strider flicked his leg out of the attacker's mouth, and deeming him no threat, tried to move on. Through the carnage, he saw his sister once again. She grabbed a male in her jaws and lifted him off the ground before throwing him into an oncoming female, causing both to slam into each other. Turning on her ankles, she smacked her tail across another female's skull before moving on. His focus was once again interrupted when a wrestling pair of males crashed into him. Strider quickly identified Glaive, who was in the tussle, so grabbed his opponent with his arms and held him long enough for Glaive to jump straight upwards and slam both feet down on the raptor's neck and head. As Glaive's victim was forced to the ground, its skull was pulverized under nearly half a ton of force. Something hit Strider in the side and his head crashed into the log, dazing him. He could hear Glaive fighting, but Strider's vision was blurry and his world was spinning. As he tried to regain his composure, he saw the fighting was only getting more brutal, more vicious, more desperate. The blades were strong and relatively well rested, but the Swifttails fought with reckless savagery that he had never seen Utahraptor exhibit before. but he had seen in other species, such as when he cornered prey that knew they were about to die, and no matter what the odds, they were always the most dangerous. Strider staggered forward, trying to pick out where to go or who to help next. His vision cleared just in time to see Glaive pinned on the ground by two males that were in the process of disemboweling him with their jaws. There was a scream, and Strider turned to see Falcon fending off a female with a broken tail. Half of Falcon's left side was covered in blood. Strider moved to help her, ignoring the fact that with each step he took he felt how wet the earth was now from the sheer amount of blood and ruined pieces of flesh there was. But another Utahraptor was coming in from his left, and out of the corner of his eye, Strider saw exactly who was running him down. Swifttail had found him. She shoulder barged him, and Strider was sent rolling to his right, but he moved with the roll, and as he flipped over he jumped to his feet, ready to attack. However, in that moment he made a critical error. He looked at the sister he once loved, and hesitated. That was all Swifttail needed. She moved in with her mouth agape. Strider tried to dodge, but despite her now being larger and heavier than him, Swifttail was still faster. She clamped her jaws over Strider's shoulder, serrated teeth cut through feathers and skin alike, puncturing into his muscle. Strider cried out in pain, and knowing biting back wouldn't be effective, he lifted one leg up and stabbed his sickle claw into Swifttail's thigh, and as luck would have it, his talons sunk into an already open wound. Swifttail screamed in pain, letting go of her brother, but before he could put his foot down and swing at her with his arms, she unleashed her own flurry of slashes. Strider backed up as a barrage of swiping claws were flung at his head. He tried to dodge, but despite Swifttail being hungry and fatigued from fighting, she was still too fast for him. Her curved claws slashed across Strider's face and neck. He brought up his own arms to block, but that barely reduced the force of her impacts. Just like the rest of her clan, Swifttail wasn't holding back, even if it killed her. Another hard swipe to the side of the face and Strider slid on the wet earth, smacking back down once again. He was completely open to attack when he heard a defiant screech. It was Falcon. She was running towards Swifttail, building up speed with her arms outstretched. Swifttail turned to face her, right before Falcon dipped low to jump up at her opponent. In a flash, Swifttail shot her leg up, and then swung it downward, her killing claw extended, just in time to cut down the right side of Falcon's face, and splitting her eye in the process. Falcon wailed in pain, bringing her hands to her face as she misstepped and crashed to the ground. She continued screaming and writhing on the ground, in shock from the life-changing injury. Strider was furious, and rose to his feet, hissing in rage, but Swifttail pivoted her feet and slammed her tail across Strider's body, making him crash into a tree. He couldn't see the battle still going on around him. He could barely see what was going on around himself, but what he knew was his sister was looming over him now, ready to kill him. As his vision cleared, that was exactly what he saw. Swifttail was opening her mouth, about to plunge her teeth into his neck. Suddenly, she was pulled backwards, only slightly, but enough to make both raptors look to the end of her tail. It was Rough Guts, biting into his sister's tail and holding her back. Strider could see it in his eyes. Rough Guts didn't want to fight a sibling. He just wanted her to stop. There was an abrupt moment of silence, as the three were suddenly together again. "Swifttail, don't do this," Rough Guts begged the sister that he had grown up beside not so long ago. Swifttail didn't hesitate. She ripped her tail out of Rough Guts' mouth and dove at him. Before he could react, she had sunk her teeth into the middle of his neck. He didn't fight back, not even as Swifttail placed one foot behind her, and then tore her head in the same direction, taking the majority of Rough Guts' throat with it. Strider could only stare in horror, as his last remaining brother briefly lifted one arm to his gushing throat, and then with one final glimpse at Swifttail, he collapsed to the ground, blood flowing from his shredded neck, and then the light in his eyes faded.
You were always a fool, Rough Guts.
Swifttail stated with only the slightest hint of pity. In that moment, everything went blank in Strider's mind. It was as if time had stopped, and the image of his brother, the one he had connected with longer than anyone, dead on the blood-stained ground. The moment passed. Then the most all-consuming, incandescent rage he had ever felt erupted from somewhere deep within him and flooded every cell of his body. Strider moved as if he had no injuries or fatigue. He rose so fast he nearly tore the muscles in his legs, saliva spraying from his mouth as Strider launched himself at the one who killed his brother, and for the first time in their lives, Swifttail wasn't fast enough. Strider delivered a devastating jumping kick that snapped across Swifttail's upper jaw, cracking the bone. She snarled in anger and lunged forward, but as one of Strider's feet touched the ground, the other shot forward and landed dead center in her chest, breaking her sternum. The female raptor reeled back for the first time in the entire fight, trying to draw in breath. Strider was on her in an instant, arms and serrated claws outstretched. He swung his arms at Swifttail with blinding speed. He didn't land every one, but he was relentless, slashing at any part of her that he could reach. He cut through feathers, scales, and flesh. Swifttail tried to block or counter, but Strider's furious attack was overwhelming. She couldn't fight back, she couldn't get away, and she knew Strider wasn't going to stop. Strider couldn't be stopped. The slashes just kept coming. All the while Strider was part panting, part screeching, a horrific sound that echoed even over the cries of the dying. Strider had cut Swifttail so many times she was almost unrecognizable. Blood seeped from almost every wound on her body. Not done, Strider jumped up again and kicked her across the head, making her stumble to the right. With barely any strength left, Swifttail breathed in and threw herself at her former brother in an attempt to tackle him to the ground. Strider pulled down, and then flicked his head upwards, slipping between her arms, and sinking his teeth into her exposed neck. Strider bit deep. Swifttail's claws slashed across his side, but he didn't care. He placed one foot back, and then tore his head in the same direction, ripping Swifttail's throat out. She felt hot liquid begin to cover her chest and arms. She tried to breathe, but found she could barely gasp for air, and knew she was dying. Strider headbutted her, and she collapsed on her back. Still unable to breathe, Strider was over her, one leg keeping her pinned to the ground. He looked into her eyes, and let out a blood-curdling scream right in her face. It was one of pure fury, and went on for so long, Strider's lungs began to burn. He finally stopped and looked down at Swifttail, who was now taking her last breaths. Slowly but surely, Strider's expression changed from one of blind rage to one of haunted sorrow. The siblings stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, wondering how it all came to this.
Why? Why didn't you just listen to me?
Strider spat, as if by some miracle this could all be changed. Swifttail opened her mouth trying to speak, but blood just ran from the final wound Strider had inflicted on her.
Brother.
That was her final word, before the light left her eyes as well, and her limp skull fell to the earth. Strider felt numb. He would have stared down at Swifttail or collapsed in exhaustion if it wasn't for the calls of the other Utahraptor bringing him back to reality. Around the battlefield lay the dead and injured of both sides, but a victor was now assured. The remainder of the Blades pack had arrived, and were now running into the chaos helping their clanmates, and tearing apart the invaders that were too weak to put up any fight. What was an even battle had now become a rout, as those that couldn't get away in time were overwhelmed and killed. Only 2 adults and 3 sub-adults from the Swifttail clan were able to get away. All were injured. They likely wouldn't last long on their own. Strider stared past the one-sided battle and looked amongst his clan. So many were dead or injured in ways that they may never recover from. Possibly the biggest blow to the clan was that their lead male Claymore was dead. He and the female he had been fighting seemed to have mutually killed each other. Already his partner Dadoshi was over his body, grieving. Now tensions over leadership in the clan would follow this disaster, just to make things worse. Dagger and Sickle were still alive, though both were injured. Sickle looked like she was struggling to stay standing. Strider couldn't bring himself to look at the bodies of the dead for long, not even his brother. He couldn't bear any more pain. It was then he saw Falcon struggle to get to her feet, still hissing from the sting of losing her eye. Strider, despite barely having enough strength to walk, moved to her side. He placed his head under her own and slowly cooed. Gradually, with her partner now by her side, Falcon's heart rate slowed, and she rested on his shoulder, finally able to calm down. The battle for the Blades' territory was over. It had cost many of the pack members, and had also led to the total destruction of the Swifttail pack, a neighboring clan that had held its territory for countless generations. Did that mean that Strider was one of its last living descendants? He couldn't stand the thought, and together with Falcon lay down on the ground. His injuries and the experience of killing so many, including his own kin, almost too much for him. The late arriving members helped their packmates as best they could. Right now they needed to heal and rest. The business of who would take leadership and what would become of the now vacant neighboring territory would be dealt with later. Falcon had drifted off to sleep, and Strider was about to follow when Dagger, despite his injuries, approached to check on the two. Strider saw the bite marks on his neck and lower jaw, plus the many scratch marks on his body, along with that he only had one finger remaining on his left hand.
You two alright?
Dagger asked despite himself, not knowing what else to say. Strider barely shook his head. He just couldn't find it within himself to even respond. He wished Dagger would stop pushing himself so hard all the time.
Strider, brother.
Dagger said. Strider visibly tensed at the word, his mind flashing to the moment he lost himself to an anger so vile it felt like his body had been altered, poisoned in a way that he could never return from, and the final moments of Swifttail's life that were burned into his mind forever. A moment that destroyed in his mind who Swifttail used to be, the sister that he loved.
Don't call me that. I can never hear that word again.
Strider struggled to respond. Dagger saw the pain in Strider's expression and nodded before walking away. He would never call him a brother again, but he would from now on always be one to him. Strider steadily calmed down again and looked over Falcon. They had all lost so much today. He swore to himself that no matter how badly life would get in the future, he would not lose her. He would rebuild their clan, and one day he might be able to forget everything that happened on this field and know something of peace.